Okay, guys, y'all are really going to enjoy this video. This is a continuation of Scott pretty much talking about all these rookie wide receivers mainly. We cover a couple, well, he covers a couple of running backs, but really a deep dive on the wide receiver class. And this wide receiver class is supposed to be the best we've seen in years. It's supposed to be super deep, so I think it is important at looking at these deeper players. But before we get into the video, I owe all of y'all a massive thank you. I know that I want to get y'all 2 videos today. Y'all know that I've been talking about this for pretty much every video you've seen since I made this announcement. But the only thing is YouTube is pretty much just banishing any channels that want to do more than 1 video a day. I don't understand why, but the way with their algorithm works is you have to do 1 a day. I don't get it. But if you want for us to continue to do 2 videos a day, we're beating the algorithm right now. And that's just by y'all liking the hell out of the videos. Y'all are absolutely killing it. I really appreciate it. I owe y'all all a massive thank you. But just in case the YouTube algorithm stops recommending our videos, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you like and leave a comment. That's how we're going to beat this. But thanks so much, guys. If y'all want more of Scott's work, make sure you go down to the description below. He has a Dynasty podcast and a redraft podcast. I'll leave links to both below. Thanks, guys.
So I mentioned Jalen Reagor. So let's talk a little bit about Jalen Reagor. He's going to be right around in that same range. And, you know, he's a very polarizing player right now for people in Dynasty. And I think for me, I'm going to kind of do the same thing that I'm doing with Mims and look at the landing spot and the draft capital. But I think we're pretty certain that those 2 things are going to be pretty decent. You know, I think these guys are going to be all drafted in the top 40 picks. So I'm not concerned about the draft capital really. And then the landing spot's just going to come down to what are my expectations. You know, if I find Jalen Reagor lands in a bad spot, I'm willing to take him as my potential redshirt guy for year 1, kind of like what we saw with A.J. Brown last year, because the landing spot can change so quickly. You know, especially if he goes somewhere where there's any sort of quarterback issue or there's any sort of coaching controversy, you just never know when things could flip the lid and completely change from, you know, mid-season on to the rest of the year. So I think with Reagor right now, if I had to pick, he would definitely be over Mims for me for that reason, just because I don't think you're going to see a lot of difference in terms of draft capital. But again, I think he's going to cost you a top 15 pick for sure. So it's really just preference. You know, if you really prefer Mims to Reagor, I can't argue with that. I'm just kind of laying out my process as to how I would rank these guys right now, barring, you know, something crazy happens with landing spot or something unforeseen happens with draft capital. So I'm not a huge fan of Reagor, but I'm taking this tier with basically looking for value. I don't really care necessarily about how they're going to produce in the NFL because my first goal is to get the best value. And right now, I think you have to slot Reagor in over Mims if you really made me pick today. Couple other names I wanted to mention. Had a request to talk about Donovan Peoples-Jones. I actually talked about Donovan Peoples-Jones about a month ago on another podcast. It's the Perfect Cast podcast with Bruce Mattson. He's another writer over at DLF, and we talked pretty in length about Donovan Peoples-Jones. And initially, I had thought Donovan Peoples-Jones would be a guy that would be undervalued. Just because, you know, what he did in his combine, and then you combine that with what he did in his college career, which was underwhelming. But we've heard that narrative. I mean, how many times this year have you heard the narrative when you're talking about Donovan Peoples-Jones? Well, his quarterback was terrible. You know, Shea Patterson was terrible. He didn't do him any favors. And that's probably true. But my concern with Donovan Peoples-Jones is, again, you know, he's on the young side, so that's good. But you also look at his production in college, and it actually got worse in his junior year than from his sophomore year. Now, they brought in a couple other receivers. That was actually a pretty crowded receiver room at Michigan his junior year. But you kind of just look at him, is he more of a paper tiger than a guy that's actually going to be somebody that's going to help your fantasy team? So right now, he's projected to go somewhere in the early 3rd, late 2nd round. But I could also see him being a player that falls just because there's going to be some other things that he doesn't necessarily contribute to. Now, the one good thing about him is he did play at least some on special teams in college. But again, that was more in his freshman year. And a lot of times you see receivers play early on in their freshman year or even early in their sophomore year on special teams, and then that wanes off, you know, as they become more of a part of the passing offense. So maybe that was the case. I'm not somebody that watches a ton of games on these guys, so I can't really give you the context. I can just look at the numbers and the production that he had, and it's concerning that obviously his special teams dropped off significantly in his junior year, but then also his production dropped off in his junior year. So not a great trend right there. And then when you look at, you know, some other comparables, I've seen some comparables of him to somebody like Jalen Strong is who they compare him to on Player Profiler. But some other ones, you know, like Dorial Green Beckham, I've seen mentioned. Now, Dorial Green Beckham was even bigger than Donovan Peoples-Jones, but just from a metric standpoint, a guy that just checks all of the boxes. But then you look at, is he actually a good receiver? So I think that's the question with Donovan Peoples-Jones. Now, if you look at where his value is right now, like what type of pick he's going to cost you in a league, that's interesting to me because you're probably going to have him in the same range with a lot of those other receivers that we don't know necessarily what their draft capital is going to be. So guys like Tyler Johnson and guys like, I'll talk about Antonio Gandy Golden here in a second. But Devin Duvernay, KJ Hamler, you might be able to put Brandon Ayuk in there, but I think he's going to go a little bit higher. He'll probably be closer to the tier 2 than he's the tier 3 and tier 4. Michael Pittman, who we covered the other day. Brian Edwards is another one. So I think you're going to see this massive influx of receivers that are going to get drafted like the late second to the mid third round range, kind of the same range we were talking about potentially starting to take a running back. But a lot of it's going to be preference based. You're going to have your Devy people that absolutely just love Tyler Johnson or that absolutely love Donovan Peoples-Jones. And they're probably going to overdraft those guys, even if the NFL draft capital doesn't say that. So I think that's going to be big. I'll be interested in Donovan Peoples-Jones if he does get drafted in the top half of the third round, because I do think he's going to present a value just from that standpoint over players like Chase Claypool, over players like Brian Edwards, Tyler Johnson. I think he's going to present a little bit better value because those players I think have either a little more hype or they're a little bit more from a standpoint of the Devy hype. I think they're going to have a little bit more buzz. So they're going to end up going higher when the draft capital says that possibly Donovan Peoples-Jones should be the first one off the board in that range. So basically create your tiers and look at your third and fourth tier of receivers and then just determine based on the draft capital numbers, who you already prefer. I will warm up to Peoples-Jones if that's the case. But if he's going to simply just live off of his combine hype and live off of his Devy hype and he doesn't have the draft capital to back it up, if he goes in the late third, early fourth, and he is, right now I'm looking, he's projected to be the 12th receiver off the board. And if he falls below Michael Pittman, below Brian Edwards, even below other guys that I definitely would prefer him to, like Van Jefferson. I talked about him being a potentially sneaky guy, but I think he could go drafted ahead of Donovan Peoples-Jones. So, if he's like the wide receiver 17 or 18 off the board, I just have a hard time picking him in that tier where it's a late second, early third round rookie pick. So it'll just all depend on your draft. If you're in a draft where there's a ton of people that prefer running backs in this range, you may be able to get good value on him. So yeah, you might be able to get him like mid third of a super flex draft. And if he has third round draft capital, I'd be totally fine with paying that price. Another one that kind of falls into the same range, actually projected to go off the board at the wide receiver 23. But if you look at their DLF ADP, it's Antonio Gandy Golden. So on DLF, Donovan Peoples-Jones and Antonio Gandy Golden are player 29 and player 30 in the Superflex ADP. So that is the 305 and the 306. But if you look at the NFL draft capital, Donovan Peoples-Jones is receiver 12 and Antonio Gandy Golden is receiver 23. So do the math there. If you just compare the two, it would be clear that Peoples-Jones is a much better value. They have Antonio Gandy Golden projected to go at the end of the fourth round, the second to last pick of the fourth round right now. So if that's his draft capital, that's going to match where his current value is in terms of where he's coming off the board from a receiver standpoint. But it's not going to match his ADP. So just on first glance, I would say Donovan Peoples-Jones is a much better value than Antonio Gandy Golden, and Antonio Gandy Golden is way overvalued in terms of ADP. They have him going, this is what's crazy to me. He's at number 30 overall, so the 306, and they have Jake Fromm going at 35, so at the 311. I just don't see, if Jake Fromm is drafted in the first 80 picks, I don't see how you could draft Antonio Gandy Golden over Jake Fromm. And then I see other names, like KJ Hill or Devin Duvernay or Lynn Bowden or Chase Claypool. All these guys are going lower. Van Jefferson. All these guys are going lower than AGG, but they're probably going to be drafted higher than AGG. So that's just a misfire for me. The numbers don't line up. Maybe we'll see some adjustment after we find out, where he lands and what his draft capital in. But as of right now, I think he's probably going to be somebody that's going to be overvalued based on his name because he did have some Devy hype. People see that small schooler, and you look at some of his numbers. He had an 81st percentile breakout age, a massive college dominator. But again, you have to adjust that for the fact that he did play at Liberty. It's a very, very small FBS school versus playing at another higher level place where he's potentially going to see these numbers impacted by other players. So if you're a big believer in metrics, I think he checks the boxes. The only thing he doesn't really check is the fact that he came back for his senior year. This is another guy that probably would have wanted to see come out last year. But he's still only 22, so he's actually on the younger side for a senior. But those are some of the highlights of his profile. The production isn't an issue at all with him. It's just going to be about draft capital, and then it's also going to be about tiering that big chunk of receivers. Do you really prefer him over a guy that gets drafted a round or two higher? So I think that's what you have to decide when you're talking about Antonio Gandy Golden.